Would you have the courage to investigate strange noises coming from a stranger's property? Most of us would ignore it and keep walking. Today, you're about to witness an extraordinary story of curiosity that led to a shocking discovery in rural Montana. Prepare yourself for a tale that will leave you breathless. A story about the fine line between captivity and freedom, and how one person's decision to investigate changed everything. The small town of Pine Creek, Montana, was known for its breathtaking mountain views, tight-knit community, and the kind of quiet that city folks paid good money to experience on weekend getaways. For 34-year-old wildlife photographer Olivia Harmon, it was the perfect place to settle after years of traveling the globe capturing images of animals in their natural habitats. She'd purchased a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, drawn to the proximity of wilderness and the promise of spotting the elusive native wildlife she specialized in photographing. It was an unseasonably warm October afternoon when Olivia decided to take a different route home from the local market, cutting through a back road she rarely used. The neighborhood was sparsely populated, with houses set far apart and large properties bordered by dense forests that climbed up toward the mountains. She walked briskly, grocery bags in hand, enjoying the golden autumn light filtering through the aspen trees, while mentally planning the homemade soup she would make for dinner. The scratching sound was so faint at first that Olivia nearly dismissed it as branches scraping against metal in the light breeze. But something about the rhythm felt deliberate, almost desperate. Scratch, pause, coming from somewhere beyond an old wooden fence overgrown with wild grapevine. She slowed her pace, cocking her head to listen more carefully, the hair on her arms rising despite the warm afternoon sun. Joseph Miller's property had always been a subject of local speculation. The rundown single-story house and collection of outbuildings partially hidden by untamed vegetation and a deteriorating fence. Locals whispered about Miller's reclusiveness, his occasional bizarre behavior at the town's only bar, and the strange comings and goings at odd hours. Most people in Pine Creek gave his place a wide berth, uncomfortable with his cold stare and the rumors that followed him like shadows. Olivia had only encountered Miller once, at the general store where he'd been arguing with the owner about a special order that hadn't arrived. Something about his demeanor had struck her as off. The controlled rage in his voice, the way his fingers had twitched at his sides like agitated spiders. She remembered wondering what kind of life he led in that isolated property, what secrets might be hidden behind those unwelcoming walls. The scratching sound grew more insistent as Olivia hesitated by the fence, her photographer's curiosity battling with the sensible voice in her head, telling her to mind her own business and continue home. She set her grocery bags down carefully and peered through a gap in the wooden planks, but could see nothing beyond an overgrown yard and what appeared to be a dilapidated shed about 50 yards from the main house, its metal roof gleaming dully in the afternoon light. "Hello?" she called out softly, immediately feeling foolish. If someone needed help, they would call out, not scratch. Yet the sound continued, now accompanied by what she could swear was a low, rumbling growl, unlike anything she'd ever heard from a domestic animal. Her mind flashed to images of the wildlife she'd photographed over the years, bears, wolves, mountain lions, but this sound was different, distinctive in a way that raised goosebumps along her spine. What happened next would later be described by Olivia as the moment everything changed. The scratching abruptly stopped, replaced by a haunting cry, somewhere between a hiss and a yowl, that she recognized instantly from her years documenting North American wildcats. It was the unmistakable sound of a bobcat, but not in the wild where it belonged. This sound was coming from inside the ramshackle shed on Joseph Miller's property. Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled out her phone, thumbing through her contacts until she found the number for Mark Lawson, the local wildlife officer she'd befriended since moving to Pine Creek. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed call, her eyes fixed on the shed while the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Mark, it's Olivia," she whispered urgently. "I think there's a bobcat being kept at Joseph Miller's property on Pinewood Drive. I can hear it in a shed. It sounds distressed. Please call me back as soon as you get this." The decision to enter someone else's property uninvited wasn't one Olivia took lightly. Trespassing in Montana could result in serious consequences, especially in a community where property rights were held sacred. but the desperate quality of the animal sounds coming from the shed propelled her forward, as if drawn by an invisible thread, her concern for a creature in distress overriding her usual caution. Finding a section of fence where the posts had rotted enough to create a gap, Olivia squeezed through, wincing as the rough wood caught at her jacket and scratched her arm. The property looked even more neglected from inside. Abandoned car parts scattered across the yellowing grass, a collection of rusting tools leaning haphazardly against the house, windows covered with sheets instead of curtains. There was no sign of Miller or his battered pickup truck, which Olivia took as both a relief and a warning that he could return at any moment. As she approached the shed cautiously, the sounds from within grew more agitated, scratching interspersed with low growls and occasional yowls that made her blood run cold. The padlock on the door was substantial but old, the hasp secured to the weathered wood with screws that had begun to pull loose after years of Montana's harsh weather cycles. Olivia glanced back at the house, confirming it still appeared empty, then made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless animals in the months to come. The rock she found was heavy enough to serve her purpose, and it took just 3 solid strikes before the screws gave way, the hasp tearing free from the rotting wood with a splintering crack that seemed to echo across the property. Olivia paused, listening for any sign that she'd been heard, then slowly pulled the shed door open just wide enough to peer inside, unprepared for the horror that awaited her. The stench hit Olivia first, a fetid mixture of urine, feces, and decay that made her gag reflexively, her hand flying to cover her nose and mouth. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, illuminated only by thin shafts of light filtering through cracks in the walls, what she saw froze her in place. In the far corner, a magnificent bobcat lay on a filthy blanket, its tawny spotted coat dulled by dirt and neglect, its powerful body unnaturally thin beneath the matted fur. Most shocking of all was the heavy chain secured to a metal collar around the wild animal's neck, anchored to a bolt in the concrete floor that allowed only a few feet of movement in any direction. The bobcat's amber eyes, glowing with a mixture of fear and defiance in the half-light, locked onto Olivia's with an intensity that stole her breath away. Here was a creature born to roam miles of territory daily, reduced to pacing the tight circumference allowed by its chains in a space barely larger than a closet. "Oh my God," Olivia whispered, her photographer's eye automatically cataloguing the details, even as her human heart recoiled from the cruelty. The empty water bowl kicked over in a corner, the remains of what appeared to be a half-eaten squirrel tossed carelessly on the floor, the oozing sores around the bobcat's neck where the collar had rubbed the fur away. The animal watched her warily, muscles tensed as if preparing to either flee or attack, the tip of its bobbed tail twitching with agitation. The shed contained more horrors beyond the chained bobcat. Stacked along one wall were cages of various sizes, most empty, but a few containing the remains of what must have been other wild animals. A raccoon's skeletal paw protruding through the bars of one, tufts of what looked like coyote fur visible in another. A crude taxidermy workbench occupied the opposite wall, covered with tools, preserving chemicals and half-completed projects that turned Olivia's stomach. Evidence that Miller wasn't just illegally keeping wild animals, but was killing and mounting them as well. Olivia's hands shook as she raised her phone to document the scene, knowing she needed evidence before authorities arrived. The bobcat growled low in its throat as the phone's camera clicked, the sound echoing in the confined space. "I'm going to help you," she whispered to the frightened animal, her voice breaking with the promise. "I'm not going to leave you here." Whether the wildcat understood her words or merely her tone, it stopped growling, those intelligent eyes following her every movement. The roar of an engine outside sent a bolt of panic through Olivia's body. Miller was returning, and she was standing in his shed with clear evidence of breaking in. Her mind raced through options as the sound of a car door slamming echoed across the property, followed by heavy footsteps crunching through the overgrown yard. She could try to explain, to confront him about the illegal captivity of a protected species, but something told her that rational conversation wasn't going to work with someone capable of this level of animal cruelty. With no time to free the bobcat safely, an animal that despite its weakened state could still seriously injure her in its fear and confusion. Olivia made the split-second decision to hide. She ducked behind a large storage cabinet just as the shed door was pushed fully open, admitting the broad silhouette of Joseph Miller. The stale smell of bourbon and cigarettes preceded him as he stomped into the shed, muttering unintelligibly under his breath. Through a narrow gap between the cabinet and wall, Olivia watched in horror as Miller approached the Bobcat, which had pressed itself as far back into the corner as its chain would allow, ears flattened against its head in a display of fear and aggression. "Feeding time, you ungrateful beast," Miller slurred, tossing what appeared to be raw meat onto the filthy floor just beyond the animal's reach, laughing cruelly as the Bobcat strained against its chain, unable to reach the food. "Still got some fight in you, huh?" Miller taunted, using a stick to push the meat incrementally closer, only to pull it away when the Bobcat lunged for it. "That's what makes you worth keeping. The others gave up too easy, no sport in it." He continued this twisted game for several minutes, while Olivia silently documented it on her phone from her hiding place, each second stretching into an eternity, as she prayed he wouldn't notice the broken lock or sense her presence. The ringing of Miller's phone provided the distraction Olivia desperately needed. He cursed, fumbling in his pocket before answering gruffly, "Yeah?" Whatever the caller said caused him to turn and stomp out of the shed, the door swinging partially closed behind him as he barked into the phone. "I told you never to call me on this number. I'll be there in 20 minutes. His voice faded as he moved toward the house, leaving Olivia trembling in her hiding place. The moment Miller's truck engine roared to life, Olivia emerged from behind the cabinet, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized she'd been crying. She approached the Bobcat cautiously, speaking in a soft, soothing voice, as she might with an injured animal she encountered during her photography expeditions. "I'm going to come back for you," she promised, knowing she couldn't safely free the powerful predator without help, regardless of its weakened condition. "Just hold on a little longer." Back at her cabin, Olivia's hands shook so badly she could barely dial Mark Lawson's number again. When he finally answered, his casual, "Hey, Olivia, got your message," was cut short by her frantic recounting of what she'd discovered. There was a long pause after she finished speaking, filled only by the sound of her ragged breathing and what might have been Mark writing something down. "You broke into his shed?" he finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I had to," Olivia replied, the adrenaline of the encounter still coursing through her veins. "You should have seen that animal, Mark. It's being tortured. There's evidence of other wildlife being held there too, and what looks like illegal taxidermy operations." She forwarded the photos and videos she'd taken, her moral certainty that she'd done the right thing wavering slightly under the weight of potential legal consequences. "I trespassed, I know, but what he's doing is far worse." What Mark said next sent a chill through Olivia's already frayed nerves. "Joseph Miller has friends in the county," he explained, his voice lowered as if afraid of being overheard. "Hunting buddies who include Judge Harrison and Sheriff Whitley. They've turned a blind eye to complaints about him before." The implication was clear. Official channels might not respond with the urgency the situation demanded, if they responded at all. "If I report this officially, Miller will be tipped off before we can get a warrant." The realization that justice might not be swift or certain for the suffering Bobcat struck Olivia like a physical blow. She thought of those intelligent amber eyes, the sores around the proud creature's neck, the cruelty of its confinement. "Then what do we do?" she asked, already knowing she wouldn't accept inaction as an answer, regardless of the personal risk. "We can't just leave it there to suffer." Mark's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, the ethical dilemma clearly weighing on him as heavily as it did on Olivia. "I can make some calls," he finally said, his voice resolute despite the obvious career risk. "I have a contact at the State Wildlife Agency who isn't connected to the local politics, and I know someone at the Wild Predator Sanctuary in Bozeman who specializes in rehabilitating abused wildcats." But Olivia, he paused, the gravity of what he was about to say evident in his tone. "We need to be careful about how we do this. If Miller realizes the Bobcat is gone before we have proper authorization, this could backfire badly." As darkness fell over Pine Creek, Olivia paced her small living room, unable to shake the image of the captive Bobcat from her mind. She had always considered herself a wildlife advocate, donating to conservation causes, and using her photography to raise awareness about threatened species. But this was different. This was direct action, potentially illegal action, with consequences that could affect her career, her standing in the community, and her freedom if things went wrong. The text from Mark came shortly after 9 o'clock. Sarah from State Wildlife Agency, driving down from Helena tonight. ETA midnight. Federal jurisdiction overrides local on endangered species cases. Gathering equipment now. We'll pick you up at 11:30. The message was followed by a second text that simply read, "Delete these messages after reading." Olivia's heart raced as she typed back a quick acknowledgement, then erased the entire conversation as instructed. The next 2 hours crawled by with excruciating slowness as Olivia prepared for whatever might come. She changed into dark clothing, packed her camera equipment in case further documentation was needed, and filled a thermos with coffee to combat the exhaustion beginning to set in after the day's adrenaline rush. By the time Mark's SUV pulled quietly into her driveway at exactly 11:30, she was standing ready on the porch, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. Mark wasn't alone. A petite woman with silver-streaked dark hair and an air of quiet authority sat in the passenger seat, introducing herself as Sarah Blackwood, Senior Wildlife Investigator for the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. "I've reviewed your photos and video," she said without preamble, as they drove through the darkness toward Miller's property. "This is one of the worst cases of wildlife exploitation I've seen in 20 years with the department. We have federal agents on standby, but I wanted to assess the situation firsthand before bringing in the full force of the law." Their plan, developed during the drive, was simple but risky. Sarah would use her authority to conduct an emergency inspection of the property based on credible evidence of an endangered species in distress, while Mark would help safely contain and transport the Bobcat to the sanctuary in Bozeman. Should Miller return during the operation, Sarah had the legal standing to proceed regardless of his objections, though she admitted the situation would become considerably more complicated if the property owner became confrontational. When they arrived at the now darkened property, Olivia's stomach clenched with dread at the sight of Miller's truck parked haphazardly in front of the house, its presence confirming her worst fear. He had returned earlier than expected. Light glowed behind the sheet-covered windows of the main house, the flicker of what was likely a television casting moving shadows against the makeshift curtains. "He's home," she whispered unnecessarily, the confidence she had felt earlier wavering in the face of this complication. Sarah's expression remained impassive as she assessed the situation. "This changes our approach but not our objective," she stated calmly, retrieving an official-looking jacket from the back seat and shrugging it on. "I still have authority to inspect based on your evidence. Mark, you stay with the vehicle, engine running, ready for quick transport. Olivia, I'd like you to accompany me to identify the exact location, then return to the vehicle once I've made contact with Miller." The walk to Miller's front door seemed both interminable and far too short, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation with unpredictable outcomes. Sarah's knock was firm and official, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Long seconds passed before heavy footsteps approached from inside, followed by the porch light flicking on and the door swinging open to reveal Joseph Miller, his imposing frame filling the doorway, eyes bloodshot and narrowed with suspicion. What followed was a masterclass in professional authority, as Sarah identified herself, presented her credentials, and informed Miller that she had received credible evidence of illegal wildlife possession and would be conducting an immediate inspection of his property. Miller's face contorted with rage, veins bulging at his temples as he launched into a tirade about private property rights and government overreach, his alcohol-laden breath visible in the cold night air as he shouted, "Sir," Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but steel-edged, "you can cooperate with this inspection, or I can return in 1 hour with federal agents and a warrant that will allow us to search every inch of this property. The choice is yours, but this inspection will happen tonight one way or another." She held his gaze unflinchingly, and Olivia marveled at the woman's composure in the face of Miller's intimidating presence. Whether it was Sarah's unwavering authority or the mention of federal agents that penetrated Miller's alcohol-fogged mind, something caused him to step back, his hands raised in begrudging acquiescence. "Fine," he spat, "but this is harassment. I got nothing to hide. The lie was transparent, his eyes darting nervously toward the shed even as he spoke, a tell that did not go unnoticed by either woman. You got 10 minutes, then you're off my property. The trek to the shed, with Miller trailing behind them muttering obscenities and threats of lawsuits, stretched Olivia's nerves to the breaking point. Sarah had instructed her to return to the vehicle once they reached the shed, but Olivia found herself unable to abandon the wildlife officer to face whatever might happen next alone. Instead, she hovered near the entrance as Sarah pushed open the door and flicked on a powerful flashlight, illuminating the interior in harsh white light. The Bobcat, startled by the sudden brightness and the presence of strangers, pressed itself against the wall, a low growl rumbling from its chest. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock at the conditions, her professional demeanor otherwise intact as she documented the scene methodically with her own camera. "Mr. Miller," she said evenly, turning to face the man who stood in the doorway, "you are in possession of a federally protected species being kept in inhumane conditions. I am confiscating this animal immediately." Miller's face twisted with a rage that transcended mere anger, morphing into something primal and dangerous. "Like hell you are," he snarled, stepping fully into the shed, his massive frame blocking the exit. "That cat is mine. Found it injured on my hunting land. I've been nursing it back to health." The lie was so blatant, so contradicted by the evidence of neglect and cruelty surrounding them, that Olivia couldn't suppress a sound of disbelief, drawing Miller's attention and recognition. He roared, putting the pieces together. "You're the one who broke in earlier. I knew something wasn't right when I got back." The situation deteriorated rapidly as Miller lunged toward Olivia, his intentions clearly violent. Sarah moved with surprising speed, positioning herself between them and radioing for immediate backup, her voice calm despite the chaos unfolding. "Wildlife officer requesting immediate assistance. Hostile subject. Possible assault situation." She gave the address quickly, then focused on de-escalating the volatile situation, her training evident in her measured tone and precise movements. What happened next would later be described in official reports as a sequence of unpredictable events precipitated by the suspect's aggressive behavior. As Miller advanced on Sarah, ignoring her commands to stand down, he inadvertently kicked over a collection of chemicals on his taxidermy workbench. The bottles crashed to the floor, their contents mixing and releasing acrid fumes that filled the small space within seconds, causing all three humans to cough and gasp for air. In the chaos that followed, several things happened simultaneously. Mark burst into the shed after hearing the commotion over Sarah's still active radio. Miller stumbled backward, disoriented by the fumes, and the Bobcat, terrified by the sudden activity and toxic chemicals, thrashed wildly at the end of its chain, its panicked movements more frenzied than Olivia had seen earlier. The combined emergency created a momentary advantage that Sarah seized with professional precision, directing Mark to help Miller outside, while she and Olivia focused on the increasingly distressed wildcat. "We need to get this animal out now," Sarah instructed, pulling a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters from her equipment bag. These chemicals could be fatal if inhaled too long, especially in its weakened state. She approached the Bobcat cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones despite the urgency of the situation. "Olivia, I need you to hold the flashlight steady so I can see what I'm doing. If I get the chain cut, can you open that animal carrier by the door? We'll need to move quickly once it's free." The bolt cutters made short work of the chain near the floor anchor, leaving the collar still attached, but giving the Bobcat freedom of movement it hadn't experienced in what must have been months, if not longer. Its reaction was immediate and instinctive. It bolted toward the open door, only to be blocked by Mark returning to assist them. The wildcat froze, muscles tensed for flight or fight, its eyes darting between the humans surrounding it and the tantalizing promise of freedom just beyond the shed. What happened next would forever remain in Olivia's memory as one of the most profound moments of her life. The Bobcat, instead of attacking in its panic, locked eyes with her for a split second that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that gaze, she saw not just fear and suffering, but a glimmer of something that felt impossibly like recognition, as if the animal somehow understood that these particular humans were trying to help. Then, with surprising docility given the circumstances, It allowed Sarah to guide it toward the open carrier, using a catch pole designed to keep both handler and animal safe during transport. Outside, the situation had escalated far beyond a simple wildlife rescue. Red and blue lights flashed across the property as two sheriff's deputies restrained a still struggling Miller, who continued to shout threats and obscenities even as he was placed in the back of a patrol car. Mark explained in hurried whispers that Miller had tried to flee after being helped from the shed, adding assault of a wildlife officer to his growing list of charges when he shoved Mark violently to the ground in his attempt to escape. The Bobcat, now secured in the transportation carrier, watched the proceedings through the metal grate with an intensity that seemed to take in and understand everything happening around it. Despite the chaos, Olivia couldn't help but feel drawn to the animal, kneeling beside the carrier to offer what comfort she could through her presence. "You're going to be okay now," she whispered, not caring if anyone thought it strange to be talking to a wild predator. "No more chains, no more shed. You're going to be free again." When federal agents arrived 20 minutes later, the operation shifted from rescue to investigation. The property quickly cordoned off as evidence teams documented everything from the conditions in the shed to the other wildlife remains found on the premises. Sarah consulted with her colleagues briefly before returning to where Olivia waited anxiously by the vehicle containing the Bobcat. "We need to get this animal to medical care immediately," she stated. "The sanctuary in Bozeman is standing by. Would you be willing to accompany us, Olivia? You've established a connection with it, and that might help keep stress levels down during transport." The drive to Bozeman under the star-filled Montana sky became a journey of transformation for everyone involved. Mark and Sarah discussed the case in low voices in the front seat, their conversation a mixture of professional analysis and personal outrage at what they had witnessed. In the back, Olivia sat next to the carrier, occasionally speaking softly to the Bobcat inside, who had grown calmer as the miles passed, its amber eyes now watching her with what seemed like cautious trust rather than terror. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when they arrived at the wild predator sanctuary, where a team of wildlife veterinarians waited to receive their new patient. Dr. Elena Reyes, the sanctuary's founder and lead veterinarian, approached the carrier with the confident grace of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding and healing wild animals. "Let's get this collar off first thing," she murmured after a preliminary examination. "The wounds underneath need immediate attention, and it's a visceral reminder of captivity that will impede psychological recovery." The next several hours passed in a blur of medical procedures, with Dr. Reyes and her team working meticulously to address the Bobcat's many health issues, from the infected wounds around its neck to significant malnutrition, parasites, and muscle atrophy from long confinement. Throughout it all, Olivia remained, sometimes observing from behind a glass partition, sometimes assisting by passing instruments or simply being a familiar presence in the room, her connection to the animal seemingly providing a bridge of trust that allowed the medical team to work with minimal sedation. "He's a fighter," Dr. Reyes announced when the initial treatment was complete, removing her gloves and rubbing exhaustion from her eyes. "It's a male, approximately 3 years old, which means he was likely captured as a nearly grown juvenile. The good news is that with proper care, nutrition, and rehabilitation, he has a very good chance of making a full physical recovery." She paused, her expression more guarded as she continued. "The psychological recovery is harder to predict. Some wildcats can never safely return to their natural behaviors after experiencing trauma in captivity. The Bobcat, unofficially named Scratch by the sanctuary staff in honor of the sound that had first alerted Olivia to his presence, was settled into a spacious recovery enclosure designed to minimize human contact while providing essential enrichment and medical care. Through a one-way observation window, Olivia watched as he cautiously explored his new surroundings, sniffing at the fresh pine branches and natural substrate that replaced the filthy concrete floor of Miller's shed, tentatively stretching muscles long constrained by chains and confinement. Back in Pine Creek, the case against Joseph Miller was building into something far larger than a single count of wildlife trafficking. The investigation of his property had uncovered evidence of multiple illegal activities, from poaching endangered species to selling their parts on the black market, from animal cruelty to environmental violations related to the improper disposal of taxidermy chemicals. When investigators discovered a hidden cache of hunting videos documenting his crimes, Miller's few remaining defenders in the local power structure quickly distanced themselves, their protection evaporating in the face of irrefutable evidence. Olivia's role in breaking the case earned her a complex mixture of reactions from the community: admiration from many who had long suspected Miller's illegal activities but feared his connections, criticism from those who prioritized property rights above wildlife protection, and a newfound respect from local law enforcement, who had previously viewed her as just another city transplant with impractical ideals. Through it all, she remained focused on what mattered most to her: Scratch's recovery and the opportunity to document it as a way to educate the public about wildlife trafficking. With Dr. Reyes's permission, Olivia began visiting the sanctuary regularly, photographing Scratch's rehabilitation process from a respectful distance that maintained his status as a wild animal rather than a pet. She captured his first tentative climbs on the natural structures in his increasingly large enclosures, the gradual return of muscle definition to his once emaciated frame, and the moment when he successfully hunted live prey for the first time since his rescue, a critical milestone in assessing his potential for eventual release. The months of rehabilitation transformed not only Scratch, but also Olivia herself. What had begun as a chance encounter, a scratching sound that most people would have ignored, had evolved into a driving purpose. Her photographs of Scratch and other rescued wildlife at the sanctuary gained national attention, leading to gallery exhibitions, magazine features, and speaking engagements, where she shared the story of the bobcat found chained in a backyard shed. Through her art and advocacy, she helped illuminate the shadowy world of wildlife trafficking that thrived in even the most picturesque rural communities. 6 months after the rescue, Dr. Reyes invited Olivia to a private meeting at the sanctuary, her expression serious but hopeful as she shared the latest assessment of Scratch's condition. "His physical recovery has exceeded our most optimistic projections," she explained, showing Olivia recent footage of the bobcat moving with the fluid grace characteristic of his species, no trace remaining of the weakness and hesitation that had marked his early days at the sanctuary. And remarkably, his hunting instincts and wariness of humans have remained intact despite his captivity. Dawn broke over the remote wilderness area of the Gallatin National Forest, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the mist rising from the valley below. Olivia stood beside Dr. Reyes and a small team from the sanctuary, cameras ready, but emotions conflicted as they prepared for the moment they had worked toward for nearly 9 months. The specialized transport carrier sat on the ground between them, occasional movements from within the only indication of its occupant, Scratch, finally ready for release back into the wild after his remarkable journey from captivity to freedom. "We've chosen this location carefully," Dr. Reyes explained in a hushed voice, though they were miles from any human habitation. "It's prime bobcat territory, with abundant prey, water sources, and no recent reports of territorial males that might challenge him immediately. The tracking collar is the least invasive design available. It will give us data for approximately 8 months before dropping off naturally, allowing us to monitor his transition without requiring recapture." Olivia nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat as she adjusted her camera settings with trembling fingers. She had documented every stage of Scratch's rehabilitation, from the frightened, malnourished captive to the strong, confident predator he had become. But this final chapter felt intensely personal in a way that transcended her professional role as a wildlife photographer. In saving him, she had discovered a part of herself she hadn't known existed, a fierce determination that had changed the course of not just one life, but many. Dr. Reyes gave the signal, and a sanctuary staff member carefully positioned the carrier to face an opening in the forest, the door aligned with a natural pathway between the trees. With practiced movements, they unlatched the door and stepped back, joining the semicircle of humans who waited in respectful silence for Scratch to make his choice. Long moments passed with no movement from within the carrier, the tension building as everyone held their breath, wondering if months of captivity had ultimately diminished his wild instincts beyond recovery. Then, like a fluid shadow emerging from darkness, Scratch appeared at the carrier entrance, his restored coat gleaming copper and silver in the morning light. He paused at the threshold of his new freedom, muscles tense beneath his spotted fur, his tufted ears swiveling to capture every sound of the forest. Most striking were his eyes, the same amber gaze that had connected with Olivia in that filthy shed, but now filled with a wildness and dignity that brought tears to her eyes as she captured the moment through her camera lens. The bobcat took one cautious step onto the forest floor, then another, his movements becoming more confident with each passing second. He didn't look back at the humans who had healed his body and restored his chance at a wild life. His attention was fully forward, engaged with the natural world that was his birthright. With a suddenness that left everyone gasping, he sprinted toward the tree line, his powerful body moving with the perfect efficiency of a predator designed for this landscape, and disappeared into the underbrush without a sound. "Remember this moment," Dr. Reyes said softly, her own voice thick with emotion as they stood watching the empty space where Scratch had vanished. "This is why we do the work. Through all the heartbreak and challenges, this moment of return, of restoring the natural order that human cruelty disrupted." She squeezed Olivia's shoulder briefly before turning to help her team pack up their equipment, leaving the photographer alone with her thoughts and her camera still pointed toward the forest. Joseph Miller's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with a sentence that reflected the gravity of his crimes: 15 years in federal prison for multiple violations of the Endangered Species Act, animal cruelty, illegal trafficking in wildlife parts, and the assault charges stemming from the night of Scratch's rescue. His case had drawn national attention, becoming a landmark in wildlife protection enforcement and spurring legislation to increase penalties for similar crimes throughout several Western states. The sanctuary had expanded its rehabilitation facilities using donations that poured in after Olivia's photographs, and the story of Scratch's rescue went viral online. Where once they could accommodate only a few large predators at a time, they now had specialized enclosures for various species, educational programs for local schools, and a full-time veterinary staff dedicated to giving wild animals a second chance at freedom. What had begun with a single bobcat had grown into a movement that was slowly changing how people viewed and valued the wild creatures with whom they shared the landscape. For Olivia, the journey had transformed her work from beautiful but distant wildlife portraits to powerful visual storytelling that connected viewers emotionally to the animals she photographed. Her exhibition, titled "Unshackled: Scratch's Journey from Captivity to Freedom," had toured major cities across the country, the proceeds funding anti-poaching initiatives and wildlife rehabilitation programs. She had found her voice as both an artist and an advocate, using her talent to illuminate issues that might otherwise remain hidden in backyard sheds and remote properties beyond public view. But on this morning, as the sunrise fully illuminated the valley where Scratch had begun his return to the wild, none of that seemed as important as the simple truth at the heart of the story: that a moment of curiosity and courage had changed everything. If she had walked past that fence ignoring the scratching sounds, if she had prioritized her own safety over investigating, if she had chosen the easier path of minding her own business, a magnificent wild creature would have died in chains, and countless others would have continued to suffer unseen.